A black SUV was driven by a skilled driver who expertly maneuvered through the flow of traffic. Behind the wheel of the Chevrolet was a young man named Simon. He calmly and skillfully controlled the vehicle. Simon never went over the speed limit if it wasn't necessary and disliked reckless driving. However, the passenger sitting to his right was thrilled by fast driving and the adrenaline rush it gave him. As a middle-ranking government official, Alfred Nelson behaved as if he were above all the rules. He liked using the Siren to speed down the road, especially during rush hour, taking advantage of the designated lane. Simon reluctantly activated the vehicle's lights and sirens when Alfred requested it, considering it an abuse of power by his influential passenger. I can understand when it's an emergency services vehicle or a fire truck. In that case, that's justifiable. But demanding the right-of-way from drivers without an important reason for it, that's just too much, Simon thought with evident doubt. He knew that this contentious passenger had a high opinion of himself and would never pass up the opportunity to use his official position for personal gain. Simon glanced at his wristwatch with concern and shook his head in dissatisfaction. The rush hour was approaching, which meant that they would be stuck in traffic. However, this scenario did not sit well with Alfred. His mood was terrible, and he had his reasons for it. That morning, Alfred had an extremely unpleasant conversation with his wife, who started a fight because the funds of her credit card had ran out at the most inconvenient moment. Alfred had been married 3 times, and each time he believed he'd found his soulmate. But as time passed, everything returned to the same old patterns, along with the arguments and other unpleasant moments that accompanied an imperfect family life. His failed personal life was the cause of Alfred's perpetual bad mood, which inevitably affected his attitude towards his personal driver. That day wasn't any different. As soon as Simon saw his boss's face, he realized that a fight was inevitable. Within 5 minutes, Alfred began to express dissatisfaction with the slow driving. "But we are driving through the most densely populated part of the city, Mr. Nelson. What if a child suddenly ran onto the road? Or an elderly person gets distracted, not to mention the other cars?" Simon tried to argue, but convincing Alfred was simply impossible. "I'm not going to pretend I'm a snail, Simon. I need to get to an important meeting on time. Do you hear me? At this rate, I'll only make it there by the end," the official exclaimed angrily. Simon turned pale and gripped the steering wheel so tightly that the tips of his fingers turned white. He didn't want to speed up, knowing it was too dangerous, but Alfred continued to insist. And when a long line of cars appeared ahead, honking incessantly and thus creating an unpleasant and monotonous drone, Alfred exclaimed with frustration, "There you go, just what I need. I told you we should have gone faster. So, what do you suggest we do now? Stay stuck in this traffic jam for an hour?" Alfred exclaimed angrily. Simon immediately tried to rectify the situation, slightly increasing the speed, but it didn't help them avoid the traffic jam. Alfred was beyond angry with his personal driver. "Well, what are you looking at? Turn on the sirens and the lights. We'll force our way through this jam," Alfred commanded. Simon was reluctant to do it, but obeyed nonetheless. Frankly speaking, he didn't see a reason to turn on the emergency lights and the siren. The truth was that Mr. Nelson wasn't in a real hurry to get anywhere, and Simon understood that better than anyone else. He knew his boss's schedule too well to believe the story about a meeting on a Friday, especially an hour before the end of the workday. Most likely, Mr. Nelson simply didn't want to be stuck in traffic and intended to use his power for personal convenience. Under his boss's pressure, Simon had no choice but to activate the lights and maneuver their way through the traffic jam. Hearing the distinct signal, other drivers grudgingly moved aside, clearing a path for the government vehicle. For Alfred, it was a moment of triumph. The official felt like the king and focused solely on satisfying his own ambitions. He enjoyed abusing his power and relished in the sight of bewildered drivers who watched his car with envy. Meanwhile, Simon felt very uncomfortable with that whole situation. However, he couldn't do anything to change it. He'd been working for Alfred for 6 months and was already used to his boss's bad temper. Simon had a pregnant wife waiting for him at home, so his job was very important to him. "Darling, if you don't like working as this man's driver, I'm sure you can find another job. Money isn't the most important thing in life," Megan said with concern. But Simon merely shook his head. He wasn't planning on quitting his job. especially after his wife's ultrasound. "We're having twins, dear. Can you imagine? We'll have two mischievous boys who will never get bored together," Megan said with a smile. Needless to say, the joy in Simon's eyes was immeasurable. He had long dreamed of having a son, and now he would become the father of two beautiful babies. Knowing that raising children would require a lot of money, Simon started saving up in advance. That was why he was willing to put up with his insufferable boss, who treated him like a servant. As he maneuvered through the orderly rows of cars, Simon felt very uncomfortable. The corridor seemed too narrow, and the risk of scratching someone else's car was significant. However, Alfred appeared oblivious to this and purposely rushed the driver. "Come on, go faster! Do you think they'll wait for you forever? Some congressmen might take advantage of our lane, and we'll end up stuck behind." Simon gritted his teeth and stepped on the gas pedal. The driver hoped to get through the corridor as quickly as possible and into the free section of the road. It was rumored that this intersection looked like a narrow bottleneck from a bird's-eye view, which was why there was always traffic jams in that spot. Simon had about 100 yards left to cover when a miniature Ford, driven by an elderly man, emerged from the lanes of cars. There was no telling why the old man did it. Maybe he didn't hear the government vehicle siren, or for some other reason. But there was nothing Simon could do at that speed. He attempted to swerve left, but avoiding a collision with the miniature Ford in the tight corridor between the two rows of cars was nearly impossible. Simon tensed up instinctively, and then the horrible screeching sound filled the air as the Chevrolet's bumper collided with the Ford's door. Alfred let out an astonished gasp, and then a smug smile spread across his face. Meanwhile, Simon had already slammed on the brakes, causing the car to sway. When he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the elderly man, he felt very unsettled. The old man was looking at the dented Ford door with tears in his eyes, shaking his head. Meanwhile, Alfred had already stepped out of the car and walked over to the driver in the miniature Ford. "Why on earth did you do this, old man? Haven't you heard the siren?" he asked. The elderly man started trembling. "No, sir, I didn't hear it. I was probably distracted thinking about my wife. I was on my way to the pharmacy to buy her medicine." "Yeah, right, you were going to buy medicine. Don't even think about trying to gain my sympathy. You'll pay for the repairs yourself. And from now on, you'll be more attentive on the road," Alfred concluded, pleased that he had resolved the conflict so easily. The elderly man continued to stand by his dented Ford, occasionally running his hand over the damaged door. Simon's mood was hopelessly ruined. He didn't say a single word during the rest of their journey. Meanwhile, Alfred felt like a hero. Simon, however, didn't think so. Using your status to intimidate a helpless old man? That doesn't make you a hero in my book, the driver thought. Simon didn't know why he did it, but he made sure to write down the license plate of the old man's Ford. Most likely it was his conscience that wouldn't let him rest, scratching at his heart like a dozen hungry cats. Having arrived at the City Hall building, Simon breathed a sigh of relief. Alfred's presence was beginning to irritate the young driver, and he didn't want to be around him anymore. Knowing the Ford license plate number, Simon decided to pay the old man a visit. But before doing so, he stopped by the bank to withdraw the money he had been saving up for his children. Simon knew that the due date was in 5 months, so he believed that he could save up more money in that time. For Simon, it was more important to do right by the old man. Frankly speaking, Simon knew that he was as much at fault as Alfred, who gave him the order to use the siren and speed up. Using the directory services, it took Simon half an hour to learn the address of the driver from the accident. As it turned out, the elderly man's name was Charles Lopez. He and his wife had been saving money for several years to buy that tiny car. But now, because of the official's bad temper, the elderly man was facing extensive repair expenses. However, when Mr. Lopez saw Simon at his doorstep, his surprise knew no bounds. Of course, he immediately recognized the driver of that government vehicle, but he didn't want to initiate the conversation. Simon hesitated for a moment, then handed Mr. Lopez a thick envelope of money and said, "Here, please take it, sir. This should cover the repairs of your car. I'm sorry for the accident. I swear, it wasn't intentional." Tears welled up in the old man's eyes. He took the money and invited Simon into the kitchen for a cup of tea, where he shared the story of his life. Mr. Lopez's son had died many years ago during the snowstorms in Alaska. Ever since then, Mr. Lopez and his wife, Anna, had been living alone. The car was their dream, one they couldn't achieve for many, many years. Seeing the joyful faces of the elderly couple, Simon realized that he had done the right thing by paying for the car repairs. Leaving Anna and Charles Lopez's home, the young driver felt incredibly good about himself. He didn't feel as guilty anymore, and his mood improved significantly. Later on, Simon did quit his job as Alfred Nelson's personal driver. Instead, he shifted his focus to heavy-duty transportation, which offered him far more opportunities. Following the accident, Simon's and Charles Lopez's families became close friends. They started seeing each other almost every week, reminiscing about the past and cherishing every new day.